I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after Kyiv suffers some of the most intense bombardments of the conflict, we look at why more drones and ballistic missiles are piercing Ukrainian defences, and assess the significance of President Trump saying Putin has gone absolutely crazy. Plus, we hear another interview from Dom's trip to Estonia and reflect on how the podcast began with Ukraine the Latest's original producer.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 27th of May, 3 years and 93 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today you'll hear from our Associate Editor of Defence, Nicholls, the Royal United Services Institute's Dr. Jack Watling, and Audio Executive Editor at The Telegraph, Giles Gear. But first, over to Dom for the latest on the military picture.
Oh, thanks, Francis. So let's work back in time over the weekend. So this morning, overnight Monday, Tuesday, was relatively quiet after a weekend characterised by a huge number of airstrikes against Ukraine. So only 60 Russian drones launched against Ukraine last night, most of which were brought down by the Air Force. President Zelensky said yesterday that over the weekend, Russia had launched over 900 drones against Ukraine over the 3 days of the weekend. Saturday, Sunday saw the largest combined strike on Ukraine of the war so far, and then Sunday, Monday went into second place. Sunday, Monday alone saw 9 Kh-101 cruise missiles from Saratov Oblast, that's about 500 kilometres northeast of Ukraine, and 355 Shahed drones, or variants of, from all around Ukraine and including in occupied Crimea. I think a dozen people were killed on Sunday. Now, we expected a fairly quiet night last night after a very rare admonishment of Putin by Donald Trump, lambasting him on Truth Social and in comments to reporters saying Putin had gone absolutely crazy. More on that from Francis a little bit later. Now, Ukraine's Centre for Countering Disinformation head, Lieutenant Andrei Kovalenko, he said on Sunday that Russian forces had recently set a new Shahed flight altitude record of 4,900 metres, or 15,000 feet for those from the aviation fraternity. And then yesterday, Ukraine's Air Force spokesperson Colonel Yuri Ihnat said Russia is increasing its production of both Shahed and decoy drones, and that Russian forces are flying drones at higher altitude. Now, just on this, on the drone war, if you like, a very interesting article in The Economist this week saying that Russia's drone production, mainly of the basic Shahed-type attack drones, which, as I say, Russia builds now under license and calls Giran, has increased tenfold from 300 a month about this time last year to the same number in just 3 days now. Now, that presents three big problems as far as I can see it. Firstly, the sheer number of drones means that Ukraine's air defence is stretched, even with many of these basic drones, and I use that term advisedly, I'll explain why in a moment, being low, slow and predictable, and therefore susceptible to ground fire. Now, they may be basic, but it's not always the case that they just fly low. They sometimes fly low, or in recent weeks they've been observed flying low and then popping up as they near a target in order to avoid that ground fire. That is a fairly clever tactic, but they are then being picked off by Ukraine's piloted aircraft like F-16 and helicopters, as well as Ukraine's own interceptor drones. There's lots of footage online you'll see of Ukraine's own drones basically hunting the Russian attack drones. I mean, crikey, what an era of warfare we are in. Anyway, the second problem is of these ballistic missiles are so fast that they need the most sophisticated air defence capabilities to stop them. And there are dwindling stocks in the Ukrainian inventory of Patriot missiles and no current exact alternative, although clearly there are other types of air defence missiles. But ballistic missiles getting through is a big problem. The third one then, as the Economist article says, Russian drones are increasingly able to avoid electronic warfare countermeasures because they no longer rely on the jammable GPS system, the Global Positioning Satellite system, instead being driven by artificial intelligence and piggybacking on Ukraine's own internet and mobile internet networks. Now, rather amazingly, the Economist article says that Ukrainian engineers pulling apart Russian drones recently discovered a note, a handwritten note, indicating the drones are controlled now through this method via bots on the Telegram social media platform, sending flight data and live video feeds back to human operators in real time. We've put a link in the episode notes to that Economist article. Very, very interesting in terms of the technological development, and I think fascinating on a human perspective that somebody through the Russian supply chain is not happy with what they're doing and left a note inside the machine. I wonder how many other airframes had such notes. Now, that second problem I just outlined is probably the worst, the dwindling stocks, which is why Ukraine, in order to try and combat this threat from the air, has gone for Russia's means of production, the factories producing the drones and all the component parts and the explosives. Now, there was more evidence of that over the weekend with Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian defense industrial enterprises in Russia's Tula Oblast, that's about 200 kilometers south of Moscow. Also in Ivanovo Oblast, about 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow. Moscow, remember, is about 600 or 700 kilometers northeast of Ukraine. So I'm just highlighting the distances here. And drone strikes also in Russia's Republic of Tatarstan. That's 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. Now, the Russian opposition outlet Astra said yesterday that at least 2 drones had struck a warehouse at the Dmitrievsky chemical plant to the northeast of Moscow, a strike confirmed by Russia's Ministry of Emergency Situations. They said the warehouse had sustained damage but gave no further details. Now, Russia's Ivanovo Oblast operational headquarters said yesterday that a drone strike near them had damaged a utility building in Kineshma. That's a town on the Volga River, about 300 km northeast of Moscow. The US-based Institute for the Study of War say geolocated footage published yesterday also shows an explosion near the Scientific Production Association, that's to the south of Moscow in Tula City. That place manufactures MLRS, that's multiple launch rocket systems, as well as grenade launchers, ammunition, and guided and unguided missiles. Now, sticking in Tula Oblast, and Astra also said Ukrainian drones had hit the Shiglovsky Val plant on Sunday. That place develops guided weapons, air defense systems, and small arms. It produces vehicles for the Panzer S and S1 air defense systems. So that's where the kind of air war is at the moment. Russia is developing a huge number of drones, and just by sheer numbers, some are getting through, the ballistic missiles in particular creating real havoc. Ukraine, in response, going after the means of production. Now, elsewhere over the weekend, little movement on the ground. Russian advances continue to the southwest of Konstantinivka. More of that in a moment. There were advances in Sumy region, small advances, but worth noting nonetheless. The local governor there confirmed that Russian forces had captured 4 villages. So writing on Facebook, Ole Harirov, who's the Sumy governor, said the enemy is continuing attempts to advance with the aim of setting up a so-called buffer zone. He said the villages of Novenka, Basivka, Veselivka and Zaravka had been occupied, adding the residents had long been evacuated. Now, Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevitz said yesterday that Russia has redeployed elements of the 752nd Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 200th Motorized Rifle Brigade to reinforce this Russian effort, this grouping attacking into the northern Sumy Oblast of Ukraine. Putin's much vaunted 25-kilometre wide buffer zone is the purpose here. It's what Putin keeps talking about. So far not had much effect in terms of stopping, well, he says he wants a buffer zone to stop Ukraine's attacks into Russia, but they are still holding some land, and obviously these airstrikes are continuing. Now, the ISW say that the 200th Motorised Rifle Brigade has been moved, having been seen very recently operating in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar, in fact most recently on May the 6th. ISW have previously noted that Russian forces' inability to get through Ukrainian defences to the west and southwest of Chasiv Yar is undermining the wider effort for major offensive operations against Konstantinivka and the Ukrainian fortress belt running north-south in that area. Now, they say redeploying forces away from Chasiv Yar suggests that the Russian military command may intend to delay its offensive operation against Konstantinivka, and supports ISW's continuing assessment that Russia does not currently have sufficient operational reserves to intensify offensive operations in several different areas at the same time. They've basically got to pick a main effort and just, well, it's no longer a main effort, it's sort of the effort, and go for it. Now, as I said, there are and have been minor advances in the vicinity of Konstantinivka in recent weeks. We've reported that. And as the ISW say, the Russian military command's decision to redeploy units away from the Donbass suggests they may be trying to simultaneously continue advances in Donetsk Oblast, in the Donbass, and establish this buffer zone in the northeast of the country, around Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv Oblasts. Russian command may think that they have a greater chance of success in the north than Chasiv Yar. Now, we will see. We will obviously keep reporting on whether or not these minor advances in the Donbass near Konstantinivka and in Sumy region continue, or if one is being prioritised over the other. Now, looking wider afield, and a previously unknown Russian hacking group was said to be behind attacks last year on the networks of the Dutch police, NATO and several European countries, Dutch intelligence agencies have said this morning. The group, known as Laundry Bear, was most likely supported by the Russian state, the Dutch General Intelligence Agency and military agency said in a joint letter to Parliament. They said the cyber attacks against Dutch institutions are part of a larger international cyber threat posed by the hacker group. Now, Laundry Bear also conducted cyber espionage against companies that produce high-end technologies that Russia has had difficulty accessing due to sanctions. And they also said in their statement, they said the group had sought to get hold of information related to the procurement and production of military equipment by Western governments and Western arms deliveries to Ukraine. All right, a couple more for me. Now, after saying peace talks in the Vatican would be inappropriate, you'll remember Sergei Lavrov said, what did he say? Something like the Pope would be uncomfortable, as apparently Catholics and Orthodox Christians can't be in the same room together. Russia has revealed its latest attempt to avoid negotiations. So Russia's defense ministry has accused Ukraine and European countries of taking provocative steps, in their words, to wreck direct peace talks. This is reporting coming out of Moscow's Interfax news agency. Now, obviously, without providing any evidence whatsoever, the Kremlin said Kyiv has increased attacks on civilian targets in Russia, fueled by Western-made drones. I mean, that's got to be wrong for starters, because most of the drones are actually produced in Ukraine now. Moscow's MOD said that 2,331 drones have been intercepted and destroyed over the past week. Then, opening another front in Moscow's Operation Avoid Negotiations at Any Cost Whatsoever, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said media reports that Donald Trump is considering new sanctions on Russia are part of a campaign aimed at, yep, you've got it, disrupting peace talks over Ukraine. I think, folks, we're going to need to get ourselves ready for this new language. So just as every Ukrainian drone strike is a terrorist attack, so pretty much any Western diplomatic move now is going to be styled as an attempt to disrupt peace talks. But underlining how much Russia really, really, really wants peace talks, if only it wasn't for those pesky Ukrainian drones, Western diplomats, or even the Pope, Maria Zakharova, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, and someone always worth listening to if you need cheering up, she said this morning that Russia is still working on a draft memorandum setting out its conditions for a possible peace deal. She said once the document was ready, it would be handed over to Ukraine, which is nice of them. They could have had another sudden ceasefire, but no, just keep scribbling away, lads. For completeness and just to show how much they think they can take Donald Trump for a ride, here's the quote from Ms. Zakharova. She said, Russia continues to develop a draft memorandum on a future peace treaty, defining a number of positions, such as the principles of the settlement, the timing of a possible peace agreement, and a potential ceasefire for a certain amount of time if appropriate agreements are reached. Fudge, 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 guff, 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 kick the can down the road. Is the Donald still buying all this? Anyway, last one for me, Francis. Profits from frozen Russian assets are going to be used to arm and repair equipment for Ukraine, Kyiv's Ministry of Defense said this morning. So under this plan, Britain is going to send Ukraine $3 billion worth of cash during financial year 25-26. The funds directed to procurement of foreign-made defence products, repair and maintenance of existing kit, loads of joint projects and procurement of other important stuff, including Ukrainian-made products. That last bit is important. Why? Listen on. So David Aloyan, who's Deputy Minister for Strategic Industries in Ukraine, said Ukrainian enterprises, as in the defence industrial base, has the capacity of $35 billion, but the shortage of funds does not allow them to be used to the full. Therefore, attracting excess profits from frozen Russian assets will be a significant boost for the production and repair capacities of the Ukrainian defence industry. They're basically saying they can do more, but they need the orders. You can't just keep going indefinitely. Now, from the British side, this document was signed by Major General Annalee Riley, an old pal of mine, Director of the Strategic Capabilities Engagement and Deployment Directorate in MOD over here. So this scheme, frozen Russian assets use of, falls within the framework of the thing called the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, the ERA, not explosive reactive armour, that's tanks. Don't get us started on that. This is a different type of ERA. Now, this ERA initiative is a joint programme across the G7 aimed at supporting Ukraine, basically looking to use proceeds from the frozen Russian assets to repay loans that the G7 countries provide to Ukraine. The total amount of the programme so far is $50 billion, part of which will be used to meet defence needs, other stuff going for humanitarian and bits and pieces like that. So an interesting plan, basically, and an interesting use of the frozen Russian assets. That's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. I want to start with the international reaction to the scale of the attacks on Kyiv over the weekend. Of course, we were off reporting yesterday because it was a public holiday here, and we put out a special episode reflecting on one of the taboo subjects of war throughout history, which is sexual violence against women. And so if you're interested in that subject, do please listen to that episode. But returning to the present updates, the bombardments on Kyiv triggered Western officials predictably renewing calls for tougher sanctions, with Estonia's foreign minister speaking for many when he said Russia's continued aggression has a simple explanation. It hasn't faced enough pressure to stop. The power to change that lies with us. He called for increased military aid, sanctions and actions targeting Russia's shadow oil fleet and frozen assets. The EU's ambassador to Ukraine, Katerina Madanova, likewise described the assaults as horrific, noting that areas where her colleagues live had also been struck. If anyone still doubts Russia wants to continue this war, read the news, she said, or listen to it. The official line out of the Ukrainian government is that the attacks were Russia's response to international peace efforts, with Kyiv's foreign minister saying instead of sending its so-called peace memorandum, the one Don was just talking about, Russia sends deadly drones and missiles at civilians. Yet in what has to be my favourite post of the entire month, a resident of Kyiv wrote this: "The postal service in Ukraine will never fail to amaze me. Even after a night of explosions and 364 drones and missiles, the package is at your door 8 a.m. sharp." Perhaps, though, as Dom says, the most noteworthy comment was President Trump's yesterday, and I do think it is worth quoting it in full. He said, "I've always had a very..." God, the script is just always the same. It's infuriating. "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy. He is needlessly killing a lot of people, and I'm just not talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. Likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favours by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. This is a war that would never have started if I were president. This is Zelensky's, Putin's and Biden's war, not Trump's. I'm only helping to put out the big and ugly fires that have been started through gross incompetence and hatred." So those are President Trump's words. Who else could it be, after all? The Kremlin's response, though, was quite telling. Dmitry Peskov eager to praise the Americans for their work on the so-called peace talks in the last couple of weeks. He said, and I quote, "The start of the negotiation process, for which the American side made a lot of effort, is very important, and we are very grateful to the Americans and personally to President Trump for his help in organising and launching this negotiation process. Of course, at the same time, this is a very important moment which is connected to an emotional overload of everyone involved and emotional reactions. We carefully monitor all the reactions. However, President Putin takes those decisions which are necessary for the security of our country. We all witnessed how the Kyiv regime threatened foreign leaders before they came to Moscow to commemorate Victory Day. Everyone heard these threats by the regime. And many leaders who were here witnessed attempts by the regime to strike Russian territory with drones, large cities, even the capital, on the eve of such an important days. These attempts continue. We are forced to take measures, and Putin does what is necessary. So in other words, we're not going to stop, but neither do we want to upset Trump, so the dialogue will remain open. Now, Dom was talking about why more drones may be piercing Kyiv's defences, and I want to return to the other subject he referenced, which is these ballistic missiles that are a major problem. It's the subject of a Washington Post article talking more detail about Kyiv's concerns on securing more Patriot air defence systems as the stockpiles sent by the Biden administration are drying up, and the new administration, as we've reported many times, is resistant to send more. As the Post writes, Ukraine's dire need for Patriots was apparent over the weekend when its air defences failed to intercept any of the 9 ballistic missiles launched Saturday night and early on Sunday. 2 of the missiles were directed at Kyiv and where 2 Patriot units are believed to be stationed. Ukrainian officials in Kyiv, however, believe the Trump administration would be willing to sell the country more Patriots rather than send them as aid. A senior Ukrainian official said he does not expect Washington to block the sale of future air defense systems, but understands the White House will not give anything away for free. The piece goes on. The Trump administration allowed Germany to re-export Patriot materials to Kyiv after Ukraine signed the minerals deal in April. But Berlin plans to send to Ukraine its older PAC-2 Patriot missiles, which, unlike the newer PAC-3 missiles, are not as effective at intercepting ballistic missiles. The only other existing system that may be capable of shooting down a ballistic is the Aster, a European missile, though that has not been proved. So if that analysis is correct and the US is indeed willing to sell its weapons to Kyiv or its allies, that is significant. It was one of the major concerns highlighted in Dr. Jack Watling's research paper for the Royal United Services Institute I cited some weeks ago, arguing that Europe could theoretically fill the gap if support by the US dwindled, but only if Washington decided not to actively obstruct the usage of its weapons. And you'll hear more from Jack shortly as Dom caught up with him in Estonia. But just staying with weapons missions, there was a significant announcement by Germany's new Chancellor Friedrich Merz yesterday, namely that, and I quote, there are no longer any range restrictions on weapons supplied to Ukraine, not from the British, not from the French, not from us, not from the Americans either. Interesting that. This means that Ukraine can now also defend itself by attacking military positions in Russia, for example. It couldn't do that until some time ago, and with very few exceptions, it didn't do that until some time ago. Now it can. In jargon, we call this long-range fire, i.e. equipping Ukraine with weapons that attack military targets in the rear. And that is the decisive qualitative difference in Ukraine's warfare. Russia attacks civilian targets absolutely ruthlessly, bombing cities, kindergartens, hospitals and old people's homes. Ukraine does not, and we attach great importance to keeping it that way. But a country that can only defend itself against an attacker on its own territory is not defending itself adequately. And this defence of Ukraine is now also taking place against military infrastructure on Russian territory. Now, those are the words of Friedrich Merz. And it's interesting on multiple levels. Bear in mind that the logic articulated there was considered a political impossibility in the first 2 years or so of the war. It wasn't until individuals around President Biden, one of which we interviewed on the podcast a few weeks ago, were pushing for permissions to be granted around Kharkiv that meant Ukraine was allowed to use Western weapons to strike targets across the border into Russia. Now we have the German Chancellor laying out why that hesitancy was so illogical. No wonder people are expecting that Taurus missiles may soon be sent. It's important we register the shift that's taken place over that time. The other interesting thing about that statement is it suggests the US is consenting to unrestricted deep strikes with American weapons, which is noteworthy in the present context. But to end this more political and diplomatic segment, the prisoner exchange agreed in Istanbul is underway, with hundreds of Ukrainian POWs making their way home as we speak from Russian captivity. This is the biggest exchange of the war, and it's believed that approaching 1,000 were exchanged by both sides. President Zelensky said among those returned are warriors from our armed forces, the State Border Guard Service, and the National Guard of Ukraine. Now, it is just important to emphasise the importance of this politically, not only for the individuals concerned, who, based on countless testimonies we've acquired, as have many others so far over the war, will have endured horrors unimaginable, but also for the domestic context. It is not uncommon to see protests in Kyiv and other cities by the families of those who have lost loved ones to captivity. There was a major one taking place the last time we were in Kyiv, for instance. So while this is perhaps small in the grand scheme, it is right to ask it. And so we will, of course, continue to monitor it. And I imagine there'll be some quite interesting and graphic testimony that comes out of the individuals who are now returning to their homes across Ukraine. But before we go to our last guest, I'm just going to ask Dom to introduce our interview with Jack Watling, which you recorded in Estonia.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Just a quickie. It's only 10, 12 minutes-ish, something like that. You know what conferences are like. You bump into people. They're very busy, all the rest of it. It's only grab a few minutes. So I didn't get a huge amount of time with Jack. There were many, many other things that we could have spoken about. But I wanted to zoom in on two things that he had voiced and that other people had voiced around the conference. So many Western components are turning up in these drones that are being fired at Ukraine via China. Why we're not doing something against that and against the supply lines. The second one, I spoke about this briefly when we came back. Sky Shield, this coalition of the willing, what can you do? This idea of Sky Shield provided by NATO, European NATO countries outside of Ukraine, flying jets into Ukraine, providing some sort of air overwatch or a no-fly zone, whatever it's going to be. Very, very different things, I'm paraphrasing.
And you'll hear that conversation now.
So delighted to be joined by Jack Watling of RUSI. Jack, you participated in a panel where one of the things that stuck out for me, and it might seem a bit super sub-tactical, but you were talking about why we don't take much more action against Chinese firms in terms of supply lines. And you were suggesting that actually they could hit us back really, really hard because so many of our components, and I'm thinking in particular of drones, but elsewhere across our military supply lines, are just in the gift of China to do us serious damage if we hit them. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
It's not unique to military supply lines. It's supply chains across our industries. But essentially, we don't understand the supply chains in a lot of our equipment particularly well. And so if we're talking about radars, for example, and you need gallium, where do you get gallium from? Broadly speaking, China has developed the mining and extraction of it, which is why they use that as something to hit back against the US when the US was hiking tariffs on them. If we look at UAVs, China has cornered the commercial UAV market internationally, and therefore they can produce at a price point for subsystems for drones that are far below what mil-spec or mil-only UAV producers in the West can provide. And that means that within the subsystem, ecosystem, shall we say, of drone components, they can price a lot of people out of the market, and therefore they collapse the competition, which means that if you want to get a brushless motor, for example, for the electric compowered UAV, it's probably going to be made in China. And if it's not made in China, it'll be expensive. But even if it's not made in China, the magnets for it are probably sourced from China for the same reason that we're dependent on China for gallium. Now, a lot of those rare earth minerals and so on are not necessarily that rare, but you need to develop the extraction, the supply chain, and so on. If you think about explosives, you need cotton or wood pulp. You need to pulp it. You then need to enrich it. And nitrocellulose enrichment is something that we have divested from across NATO. China has maintained the capacity, and so they are a major provider of precursor chemicals for explosives. Again, we used to have the capability. We can regain the capability, but it requires in us investing in these chemical processes and wood pulping capability and so on up the supply chain before we invest in filling shells or forging shells, because there's not much point doing that if you don't have anything to put in them.
So it's kind of Rumsfeldian. We don't know what we don't know. Are you making the point for a kind of Ministry of Economic Warfare like we used to have in the old days? Somebody who could, an arm of government that could look across the military supply line and the civil sector to see exactly how resilient we are?
I mean, I think this is why the Ministry of Defence has set up a National Armaments Director and has been much more focused on understanding the impact of sanctions on Russia and therefore mapping a lot of these supply chains as they move globally. We really learned this during the COVID pandemic, right? We identified the lesson, but we didn't learn it institutionally. And now we're being forced to. So what we're trying to do is not just say, okay, this is the person who assembles the final product. Are they based in the UK? But actually dig down and see within their supply chains where does everything come from? And then you need assured access, if we're talking about defence, to those various elements.
Now, looking a little bit wider afield, you wrote a great article recently with Michael Kaufman about the Deterrence Force. There's been a lot of chat about that here at the conference. Deterrence Force, Peacekeeping Force, Reassurance Force. These terms are bandied around and actually have enormous tails to them because they are very, very different force structures. Have you had anything here in the conference over the last couple of days that gives you greater confidence that Europe knows what it wants to achieve from a Reassurance Force or whatever label we're going to put on it?
I think there's a lot of very detailed planning being done to work out all of the potential escalation scenarios, what capabilities you would need, what the impact would be on planning. I think that governments are going to be fairly tight-lipped on what the package actually looks like, precisely until they've worked out all of the diplomatic permutations of how this could go. And so I fear that we're going to be in a low information, high speculation environment on this topic for some time, until the participating nations feel like they're in a position to come forward with a really concrete proposal that they think they can defend. So I won't be drawn on exactly what the force might look like or where the planning has got to, but I think there are a lot of people that are looking at this very seriously.
But the argument was put forward here that actually a force of 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 in a country the size of Ukraine is still a tiny force on the ground, is actually not a deterrent to Russia. It's not reassuring to Ukraine. It's actually a humiliation. It might be seen as a humiliation for the European NATO nations, and therefore don't do it. Have Sky Shield instead, and have from outside the country an air policing role, if you like. But the counter argument to that is that, well, you've got to put skin in the game. You're just doing a sort of air policing plus isn't good enough.
The air policing thing isn't a thing. It is literally not a thing, because you need to integrate with the Ukrainian air defences to avoid friendly shoot-downs, deconfliction methods, and therefore you would need extensive presence in country on the ground, liaising with the air defence units to be able to enter the airspace. And so there isn't an either-or here. This is just like people who don't understand military operations trying to come up with something that they can sell politically because it sounds low risk. So we can take that off the table.
Sky Shield is off the table.
Sky Shield as a standalone thing is off the table. It's not credible. There are plenty of people who will push it. Politicians talk about it because it sounds low risk, low friction, etc. But in practical terms, it's a nonsense. If we're talking about 20,000 troops, let's say, as a multinational force, the idea is not that they're going to stand between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The idea is that the Russians have to factor in, if they subsequently attack Ukraine, that they may well harm personnel in this force, and they may well draw themselves into a fight with NATO, which we have seen over the last 3.5 years is something the Russians really don't want. They do not want to fight NATO, right? They want to beat Ukraine. And so if that's something the Russians have to factor in, that is a risk. Now, what that gives the Ukrainians is a certain degree of confidence that they're not going to stand alone, and that because of that additional deterrent threat, the Russians are less likely to restart the conflict but through conventional means. And so that gives the Ukrainian military more confidence that it can stand, and then you can start rebuilding the military so that it is sustainable, so that it has more effective training, better, higher echelon command and control. And what the force would actually be doing on the ground is probably training and mentoring and collaboration with the Ukrainians. So I think 20,000 troops is credible. 15,000, 20,000 troops, like a multinational division, is credible. But it does have to be prepared, if the Russians do test it, to exchange fire. ultimately. Now, we've managed that in Syria. Russians shot at us in Syria. NATO fired and killed Russians in Syria. Not NATO as an organization, but troops from NATO countries. And it didn't start a war, right? So those issues are manageable, but you do need to be prepared to look them in the eye and accept that there may well be kinetic exchanges.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not risk-free, and it's a serious political judgment as to whether you go about it.
Turkey shot down a Russian jet over Syria, well, over Turkey. That's the reason they fired at it in June 2015. Now, just 3 days ago, a Russian jet overflew Estonian airspace. Markus Sakna, Foreign Minister for Estonia, said it was only for a minute, but it flew over Estonian airspace, over this whole the Shadow Fleet tanker in the Baltic Sea. Do you see more of these events happening, and is that concerning that there's more heavy military hardware in a small piece of sea, land and sky, and that there's a greater chance of something going wrong? Do you see any appetite from NATO or an individual country defending their own borders and airspace, such as Estonia? Do you think there's any willingness and readiness to open fire again like Turkey did?
So I don't think there was a capability in place to shoot the aircraft down while it was in the airspace. So there wasn't an asset that could be in place within a minute. If there had been, I think, the Estonians could have shot it down, and we would have been in a very similar situation as we were with Turkey, where Estonia would have made clear that its airspace is not up for being violated, and that would have been within its right and quite reasonable. The Russians would have been upset. The key thing is to signal to the Russians that you're not going to go further, right? You're not going to take advantage of this to then be coercive. And where we get into a slight tension is that the reason why the Russians were escorting that vessel is because an unflagged vessel was shipping oil for the Russians. And they were concerned that it might be boarded or seized. And so they were trying to deter that. If it's a case of Russian military assets pushing into Estonian airspace, then that's one thing. Where it becomes more complicated is if the Russians are going to use military force to escort ships that are dangerous, pose an environmental hazard, are not being managed safely because they don't have trained crew, probably because they've been sanctioned, and so the crew that they can recruit are less capable. Then we have an issue where Coast Guard might want to stop it, inspect it, find out whether it's doing anything improper. And if the Russians try and prevent that, then you can see how this can become politically complicated and so on. So managing the Shadow Fleet and the associated risks, some of them are about risk to the environment, risk to navigation, some of them are about trying to enforce sanctions, is an area where, nations are looking at it very carefully, and there's a lot of plays.
And just finally, it wasn't confirmed here, but it was very, very heavily hinted. Two things we can take away from this conference from the US ambassador to NATO. US troop numbers in Europe are going to go down, possibly as early as this summer. And NATO spending commitments will go up to 5%, 3.5% on hard metal and 1.5% on additional defence spending was the phrase that was used. Did you take away those two things, and how firmly do you think they are going to happen?
US forces in Europe will draw down. The question is what is drawn down. I think US has been pretty clear in signalling that, and the need for it from their point of view is quite stark in terms of the threats that they feel in the Indo-Pacific. So this is actually something that has more continuity between administrations than we would like to admit. On spending commitments, we always get tied into arguments about how much money, what percentage of GDP.
The point about numbers is fine, but I mean, this is in terms of political. This would be a massive political move.
It would, but the much bigger question is NATO has plans that are now agreed. Those plans require certain troop levels in order to be executable. At the moment, I think it is reasonable to assume, noting how difficult European countries are finding it to put together one multinational division to support Ukraine, for example, in terms of how they're talking about putting things together. It is difficult to believe that we are in a position where we can execute all of those plans with high confidence. The question is, how do you resource the capabilities needed? Percentage of GDP is I appreciate the political significance, but a less interesting question for me than what are you buying, how much training are you doing, how many units can you deploy? Does it meet the requirement that you've laid out to deter?
It's the input, not the output. Right. And I get that, but it's easy shorthand for an overworked journalist.
But I mean,
overworked, underpaid.
It's really important because when we get fixated on the GDP number, it's relative to what GDP is, which goes up and down, right? So
and there's a lot of fudge around the edges about do you include your intelligence services, etc.,
etc., etc. And if you politically drive it too high, then you'll find a lot more fudging. So I'm going to be tracking what the money's being spent on, rather than the amount of money.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jack. I know we can rely on you to track that, and we would like to chat to you when you've worked it out. Thanks very much for chatting.
To bring the episode to a close, you're going to hear from somebody else now whose name will be familiar to you. It will conjure memories for the many of you who've been with us from the early days of the podcast, and that is the name Giles Gear, lead producer of the podcast for, well, many, many, many months. And you've probably heard Dom and I's voices more than any man alive. And so it's a miracle that you're still here and sane, to be honest, Giles. You're sadly leaving the Telegraph after 4 years to pastures new, but we just thought it was an important thing to mark, really. You were so involved, so integral in Ukraine the Latest in those first couple of years. And whilst listeners may not have heard you, you were a constant presence throughout. And we thought this would be an opportunity to not only reflect on that period, and of course David's role, but also to perhaps just offer a little bit of insight into what it means to produce a podcast like this. The side that once the microphones get switched off, as it were, what happens next? So, Giles, welcome. I think up until now, people have probably only heard snippets of your voice, and you may have dubbed an interview or two, but here you are. You have the microphone. This is your moment.
Thank you so much, chaps. Nervous to be here. I'm very comfortable being behind the microphone rather than in front of it. So to be in such esteemed company is a privilege. But yeah, I was part of, dare I say, the dream team back in 2022. And I'm Nick, what you said, Francis, when we were speaking about this earlier. It was a bit of a grassroots thing, the podcast, when it first kicked off. All of us were doing it on our lunch break. David wasn't officially part of the audio team. None of us were, really. And
it was a proper Skunkworks outfit. And I'm not just talking about your aftershave.
And yeah, exactly. And I think that what started, back in the day when it was Twitter rather than everyone's favourite X, it was a fantastic use of audio, not just podcasts, where we could have live reaction, live news, live, as some people put it later, sort of history telling, a live account of what was happening on the ground. And then some bright spark, I think, wasn't anyone in this room, actually said, well, actually, let's turn this into a podcast. And so my role for those first 2 years was really, it was interesting in terms of the delivery of the podcast. Was we would record, as we are now, between 1 and 2-ish, and it was a game of how humanly quickly can we get this edited and out the door and into people's ears. Because if we're 2, 3, 4 hours later, every half hour we would notice that the news could be out of date, or we would notice a bit of drop off in listens, because why would you listen? It's like turning on yesterday's 10 o'clock news. You wouldn't really do that. What was brilliant and still is about using Twitter is that it essentially became how did I word it in my notes, Francis? I worded it better than I...
It was so eloquent, I wrote it down, Giles. You said every presenter had a microphone in their pocket.
There you go. Me an hour ago is better than me now, much more verbose. But yeah, every Telegraph correspondent, by using Twitter Spaces and then turning that into a podcast, it meant that we were able to, rather than sending microphones to people or going, have you downloaded this app or whatever? Most journalists, especially in 2022, had Twitter, were using it. And the fact that we could call them in on the show, like a live American talk show, was brilliant. And I always distinctly remember having with Danielle Sheridan on, who was on the ground in Bucha 2-3 days after the atrocities had first been reported, and was emotionally reporting more than anything else on what was happening. And just hearing those pauses and leaving those pauses is just as important in audio journalism, audio storytelling, as it is quickly cutting. But part of my role, like I say, was listening to all your lovely voices, and you do pick up on, I won't name any names, but you do pick up on people's quirks. And let's just say I'd be happy to never hear the phrase kind of, sort of, or like for the rest of my life, I think.
Well, there are certain individuals who are certainly guilty of that, of our correspondence, but we won't name any names on air. I think just to give people a flavour of the moment broadcast ends, The first thing that we do is you save the files. Now, throughout the episode, we're all scribbling away and making notes, not only for things that we might be doing later in the episode, but also of any errors, whether they be stumbles, anything that might be able to be polished in an edit. That would then be sent over to you. Sometimes it would just be me who would send my notes. Sometimes it would be a collection of people. So then you're working from the software and you're sort of culling. But how easy is that? And how's that changed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too, I could talk for hours about audio editing and we probably...
can.
Well, we'd lose our audience pretty quickly. It would just be three of us in a room. But no, exactly that. We grab the files off, and people often say, why are you doing it on Twitter and also in a audio studio with 3 different microphones? Now, why we do it on Twitter is so we can do it live, we can get a live audience, and as I just said, we can phone people in. But why we do it in the studio is because we have individual microphones, which means individual tracks. So if Dom starts coughing, spluttering, picking his nose whilst Francis is talking...
Which is a constant problem.
Constant. He's doing it as we speak right now. I can, or the audio editors now, stop picking your nose, Dom, can grab just Francis, whoever is speaking, we grab just their individual track, and they might speak for 5-6 minutes straight through, and we edit from that. And then when Dom takes over, I edit from Dom's individual track. Whereas if I just use what we call the mix or the Twitter recording, that has got all of the ums, ers, and everyone talking at the same time. So it doesn't leave you any room for editing stuff out. In the early days, we would edit on literally audio software, Adobe Audition, very common. I would listen to however long, an hour, if not more's audio, and every filler word, basically hand scrub it out, like taking an eraser. Napoleon, of course, David was always Napoleon.
This sounds like one of the circles of hell. I don't remember this bit.
I did update my LinkedIn with, a circle of hell as sort of the audio editor. But then, obviously, times have moved on, and there are certain softwares now which are uber clever. I won't name any because they're not paying me to name them, but ones where essentially you take the audio and it turns it into a Word document, and then now audio editors can go into that Word document and we can quickly get rid of ums, ahs, we can also get rid of information that might not be true or mispronunciations, and you can imagine it's a lot quicker editing visually from a Word document because we read much quicker than it is me having to listen to an hour's worth of audio. So now what would take me more than an hour to edit the length of time you've recorded now can take 20-25 minutes, and it's a game of, again, how quickly can we get it out, fact check. Most of the time you guys have done that in the moment anyway, and then publish it. It goes to your Spotify's, your Apple Podcasts, of course the Telegraph app, which everyone should have and be their primary listening, of course. And then that's the job done audio-wise, but then you guys and others would then have to write an article up and have to make sure it's all in these places. So there's a lot of polishing as well.
And of course, that's before you even factor in the injecting of an interview in there, or indeed the joins, the montages, so it's a constant process of having to think in terms of, right, what, we need to then, usually after the episode, the introduction will be written. You'll have to stitch that to the top. You'll have to then insert the joins for the interview. So obviously, for many of you, this is probably, you don't want to hear how all this comes together. The magic of the
sausage factory.
Exactly.
You never want to see inside the sausage factory.
You don't want to see it, but actually, hopefully, as a one-off, it's quite interesting to hear from the man who had to do this for such a long period of time. But Giles, moving out from the technical side and just more in the sort of the human, the moral, I mean, of course, it's dealing with very heavy subject matter, and of course you will have seen how the podcast grew and how the audience grew. You had access to the email inboxes. I mean, what was it like, just on a sort of professional and personal sense, of working on a project like this at that time?
Yeah, it felt, I'm not a journalist, I am an audio person. I've grown up through audio and radio, and then now podcasting, as we're in this golden era of podcasting. But I did and do still feel like we were doing something very important. We were documenting blow by blow, tank by tank, as Don would say, what was going on. And I did feel a very small part of history, and to see the numbers grow was phenomenal. I mean, it was, I think still is, the Telegraph's most popular podcast by a mile, which was very exciting. And it wasn't just... This is me speaking personally. It wasn't just a celebrity chatting to another celebrity about their personal life and, well, hey, we've got a podcast. It was an important thing being done. And then, as we all do, we would have the email inbox from listener interactions. And that just grew and grew to the point where I had to do a little clever one of these filters on my inboxes because it was just being flooded with questions, with fact-checking, with people trying to work out what Francis really looked like but it was sort of a shroud of
before makeup,
all of this kind of thing. And the community field that started and has continued has been a pleasure to be part of. And I, for me, some of my fondest memories are when the main episode would be done, and then myself and David would pop into our smaller studio to record the intro and the outro, and would spend probably 35 minutes on a job that could take 90 seconds, most of the time having absolute career-ending conversations whilst the microphones are up and just talking absolute nonsense. We would be discussing the ins and outs and the politics of the trade war in Star Wars: The Phantom Menace and whether it was a good idea. He would try and get me onto Napoleon. I would be doing odd impressions. And then after about 20 minutes, we thought, should we actually get this podcast made? I realised that, we should probably get it out at some point. So David, what he built and the foundation and the growth and his personality and my just adoration of working with him, and he became a really close friend, and he joined the audio team permanently. He got me into his cricket team that he set up, and they probably regret that now. Haven't got a high average this season, but my unerring love for him and what he built, it was so glorious to be a part of that. And I've got a lovely black and white photo of us both in this studio, I think, laughing, and I don't know what it is about that moment. It's a lovely moment captured, and I'm going to take that frame photo to the desk at my new job and just have that there because I'm just so proud of what he and you guys have built and continue to grow. It's hugely important.
You mentioned David there, so I don't think it's inappropriate to say this, but the last time the three of us, me, Francis, you, Giles, the last time the three of us were in this studio alone talking to the mics was, of course, September last year, that terrible day when we had to break the news about the loss of David. And it was a truly horrible time. And I continue to thank everyone who gets in touch and expresses their support over that. But Giles, personally, I was so glad that you were here in the studio with us that day. That was a horrible day. So thank you for that, on top of everything else. You mentioned the cricket, very good. You didn't mention my video pitch. I wanted to do a video series explaining military stuff to those that have no experience of the big green machine, and it was going to be sort of Obi-Wan and Luke, me talking Giles through various military isms and him being a bit of a sort of idiot abroad type thing. But with the joke always back on me. I wanted to call this All the Gear and No Idea, but it was, and there's still room for that.
I know, but do you know, whilst you were speaking today, it's been an absolute honour being with you guys in the studio. But whilst you were speaking today, I did think there could be a spin-off, Ukraine the Latest, slightly more light-hearted, led by you, Dom, called Droning On.
Oh,
that's what I thought. I know it's.
He does improvised comedy, don't you? That's.
But I genuinely thought that with the military stuff, there should be a spin-off called Droning On with Dom Nicholls. I think that would do quite well.
Anyway, Giles is about to leave the building.
The door there.
Yeah.
No, seriously, so I have a question for you, Giles. You've expressed very well there the podcasting, the scene. But what is it about the audio medium that means podcasting in the last few years has just rocketed, even as radio audiences have declined?
I mean, I don't have a good enough answer. I mean, we had the podcast show last week, which is this global conference for 2 days in London where everyone, it seems to be, and their mum comes along for talks just like that. So I wasn't there and I wasn't doing a talk on it. So
neither were we.
Well, you were reporting on the. But anyway, I mean, I think that there is a bit like radio in the olden days, and radio is still popular, and it's sort of it's been interesting how the boundaries have blurred in audio generally, I'd say, between radio and podcast and what's on demand and what's this. But I think that it is a one-on-one experience. I think people appreciate the long formness. You'll see a lot on with BBC television. There'll be 6 episodes of 30 minutes each kind of thing. Whereas podcasts, if there's a story to tell, you can spend 2 and a bit hours, or if it's just a quick one, you can do 10 minutes. I mean, so I think that the long form of it, the taking it wherever you go, we can all pop it in our cars, we can listen in the bath. I mean, my mum, I worked for 7 years in radio. My mum didn't really know how to listen to the radio station I worked for, but as soon as she got onto The Rest is Politics, she had somehow navigated her way through Spotify and was listening on her Alexa. And she sort of, when she opened the box of Alexa at Christmas, she went, "Oh God, I hate technology." But because of a podcast that she wanted to listen to, she had learnt that, and she listens to it wherever she goes. So I think there's something about the intimacy of it and your favourite host, and we're in a really exciting time for podcasts.
Who's your favourite host?
My favourite host, my favourite podcast.
Careful.
Don't worry. It's called What Went Wrong. It's a film podcast from America, and also The Weekly Planet, which is a film podcast from Australia. So yeah, hedging my bet set. But do you mean out of you two generally?
Yeah.
I think you complete each other. That's all I'll say.
That was the most politician's answer. Well, I think
two little Lego pieces, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah, and if you tread on one, then it's bloody painful. Yeah. Anyway, right. So I think we better slowly wrap this up before we go to the final thoughts. And I think I know, Dom, you've got one that's a bit more on the subject at hand. Are there any particular memories, Giles, that are fond for you? I mean, of course, we also spent time together in Washington, and I wonder if that experience is one that will stick with you.
I mean, yes. I just want to say, firstly, I think what you two and the whole wider team and everyone who's popped on the podcast once as a contributor or multiple times, what you are doing and the mission that you're doing through audio and through the podcast is phenomenal. I'm just so grateful for your time and for your it's important. Don't lose sight of that, guys, because I know it can, there's a lot to get through every day, and everyone's got day jobs in a way, and you're giving up the best time of the day at lunchtime to do this, so it's really important what you're doing. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly with David in mind, we had such a good time in Washington, and a particular fond memory of mine was David and I were due to do an interview, I think on a Tuesday morning, and I perhaps had slept in a little late. I'll put it down to the jet lag, nothing to do with any beverages the night before. And he said, "Meet you in the lobby." Yep, meet you in the lobby. Great, meet you in the lobby. Meet you in the lobby. I got down to the lobby of the hotel, obviously. I said, "I'm here in the lobby." And it was about 11:15, interviews at 11. "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm in the lobby of the Blah Fiscal Institute for the wherever." Very important building, 25 minutes away, because he meant the lobby of where the interview was. And I said words to the effect of, "Oh dear," I think it was.
I think you had the recording equipment,
yeah,
didn't you?
I had the recording equipment, so David had to just turn up to this very important place, probably with a mobile phone, and go, "Sorry, my producer is in the lobby of the hotel." But then we had a sort of fun sightseeing tour. It felt like I was on a lovely trip. We went to see all these amazing, the White House and all of this. And of course, that live show at the embassy sticks as a real career highlight, with the amazing 100 or so people, really amazing, and guests. It was just mad, and it felt like a mini version. I mean, being with you three felt like being with the Beatles -1. When we were walking into the embassy, you had people trying to, rip off your jackets and get autographs, and it was great fun. But
that bloke threw his underpants at you, didn't he, Francis?
He did. I think it was more of a dirty protest. But anyway, I think that just seeing the love for the podcast and getting to, I didn't know at the time that would be really cherished memories with David, with or without recording devices. I just hold them in such high regard, and I think, never lose sight of that.
Well, Giles, it's been a pleasure working with you over this throughout the duration of the war, but also beyond that. And of course, you've worked on many other projects here at the Telegraph, and I think I speak for everybody in the audio department and to the many listeners at home who've experienced your work, even if they've not heard your voice, just to say thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you've done, and you will be profoundly, profoundly missed by all of us here, and best of luck with all of your endeavours. For final thoughts, we'll go back, as ever, Giles, we'll give you the very last word as the last guest of the day. But Dom, where do you want to leave listeners?
Well, I will leave listeners with the wonderful Giles Gear. Giles, thank you for everything. This wouldn't be it without you. Everyone does their little bit, but it wouldn't have got off the ground, I don't think. I'm sorry for that, just then. If you hadn't been around, I wish you all the best in your new ventures. But thank you so much. And one final question. You're leaving Do today. It's now 10 to 2 in the afternoon, London time, and yet your leaving drinks are planned for 6 o'clock. Why not? We can chin this off to Francis and be in the pub in 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, I mean, they are officially at 5 rather than 6. I think all I'll say is because certain individuals weren't free at the end of this week for certain reasons. So we had to bring them forward a bit. But to bring them forward to a rainy Tuesday immediately after a bank holiday is sensationally poor scheduling from me. So I would admit that, yeah.
Yeah, spoiler alert, it's going to be an interesting week or so, but we won't say any more for now. But Giles, as our guest for the last time in the Telegraph studios, where do you want to leave listeners?
Really, really putting me on the spot there. I just think thank you to the listeners, because if no one pressed play or told a friend about the podcast, it wouldn't have grown to the level it has. And I think, like I said, we see so much growth in podcasts, but to see the immense audience that has grown and sustained all over, particularly in the US as well, it's amazing. So I think for listeners, keep listening, keep telling your friends, because it's a great educational tool. It was great just sitting in here listening to you guys do it. I mean, maybe we should have a chef's table where listeners can pay an extortionate amount of money just to sit and see it recorded. But I just want to thank everyone who's listened, and just pay tribute to David, who was a dear friend of mine, and I miss immensely. And I think that the podcast is I can't think of a word, more than a legacy that he has left behind. It's just phenomenal. And he loved history, and that's doing him a disservice. He more than loved it. I can't think of a better word because I don't read enough history, really. And the fact that he has contributed real impactful contemporary history and is a part of it, I think is a testament to the man. And I wish, and I try to be more like David in my personal and professional life. He was so gentle, and he was so interested in you. However annoyed he would be, would never lose his temper, or he was just a real gentleman. And I miss him dearly, but I'm glad that we have a record of his voice and personality on the podcast. So yeah, thank you to everyone who's listened for these years.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.